Okay, dear students, this is our last tutorial before the semester break, and also I think the last tutorial that is relevant for assignment 1. So I left the early years framework last because I would prefer students to actually address or describe the literacy activity in relation to the Australian curriculum, simply because when we use the early years framework, it just gets a little bit complicated. Well, but some of you actually did try to describe your literacy activities with children in schools where you have already taught, or kindergarten, or even the forms of literacy tool, the kinds of literacy tools that you use with your own children. So let us start playing a little bit with it so that we can find some support here through this tutorial. So first of all of you know that the early years learning framework consists of practically 3 different, let's call it capabilities, or 3 different, 3 organizing dimensions, which is being, becoming, and belonging, right? So we have them here on the left. I probably could have done a better job had I probably written them, you know, from top to like a little bit differently. So you can select this and then go to text direction, and you can have it this way so it takes less space, but you also, oh, well, there you go. It didn't work out very well. I would have to work with properties of a table. But that's what I meant. It sort of turned it a little bit sideways, so it doesn't actually take that much room. Anyway, so we have being, belonging, and becoming. Now, if you have an untrained eye, which probably at your stage of preparation for teaching, you probably might have, what I wanted you to see is being, belonging, and becoming are actually no different than what we had in Australian curriculum, which is the critical and creative capabilities, the cultural, intercultural, and ethical, and then we had also the social and personal capabilities. Because if you actually one day happen to look into our, okay, this is module 4. So module 4 prepares you then for assignment 2, and it will teach you how to turn the process that we learned for assignment 1 now into a planning process, into a process for planning students' learning experiences. You will notice that the first item I have here is actually the concept of difference. And when you open the PowerPoint, it will take you to this link. I put that PowerPoint on author stream. You will see it simply because I can put there any pictures or anything, and I don't have to worry about copyrights, just in case university doesn't like some pictures or something, and I might have forgotten to reference it. So those references, then the responsibility for copyright goes to the author stream website. Not anymore, it's a matter of university. So that's just a hint for you as well. Anyway, so when it comes to the concept of being, I mean, obviously the early years learning framework explains to you what that means, and obviously read it, but you must remember that any policy document is a compromise. It's also written in a way that it makes sense without teachers going to complicated textbooks and you know, developing strong knowledge of theory and so on. So it's a document that most people can understand, including parents. But now, in order for you to actually integrate this curriculum into a well-informed practice, we need some more information about how to understand those concepts of being, belonging, and becoming. And here I expose you probably once again, I'm not sure if I spoke about Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu was a French sociologist. He died maybe about 10 years ago, and he's changed the world. And our students on campus said, and how did he change the world? Well, the way he changed the world was he was a sociologist, and he gave us conceptual tools. So things like the social capital, symbolic capital, so different forms of capital he actually introduced in order to analyze how society works. And he also introduced the concept of habitus. And habitus means a space you occupy in the society in a given moment of your life. So it doesn't mean that you always have to be in the same habitus or in the same space. It just habitus determines what kinds of capital is available. Habitus describes the kinds of capitals that are available to you to act on other people. Right? So not all capital is available to you at the given time. So for example, if you walk on the street, people don't kneel in front of you, right? But if a pope does, then people do kneel in front of him, you see? So the pope in Christian religion has a different, or in a Catholic religion has different habitus, and therefore people react to the Pope differently than they react to you. So that's what it is. At any given time, we have different forms of capital that are available to us, and we use it in order to act on people. So Pierre Bourdieu was quite useful in this area. He gave us useful concepts, and people use it till today. Well, he didn't. He died of cancer here. Otherwise, he would have been still active in his field. So what he also says, or his whole work, basically is informed by the understanding that not everyone accumulates through life the same amount of being. And you can read it. What that means is, and you can actually start deducing it yourselves now, not all of us have equal chances and opportunities to actually accumulate enough forms of being so that we can have expansive life. And I want to use the word powerful, but it doesn't mean dominating, but what it means is with opportunities to engage in a rich way, right? So a person who can read, a person who is unable to visit places, to converse with a multitude of diverse people, and also engage with diverse networks in order to exercise their life's purpose on an increasingly informed basis. Obviously, this person has more being than a person who basically, for whatever reason, say in Cambodia or in Australia, say I saw people in Cambodia that spent the entire life in one spot on the street selling rice that they just have prepared in a particular way. It's fun to do it one day, for 7 days, but if you spend all your life in the same little hut doing the same thing over and over again, obviously your capacity to act on the kinds of beings that you accumulate are less impactful in terms of a range of people and range of things you can do than, for example, a university professor or maybe Bill Gates, right? So that's why you will see that when I talk about being, yet again, I actually introduce the concept of range. Because when you will be evaluating how much being do you actually make possible for your students to, for your children or for your students to access, then you would need to evaluate the range of experiences you make to them available so that they can actually draw on them to be to act on an increasingly informed basis. So now when it comes to belonging, Obviously, when children are given greater access, see, I'm repeating the same story as I did with the Australian curriculum. So obviously, when you give students access to greater range of resources and that belong to different communities, you as a result give students access to more communities. You make them more familiar with a greater range of communities, so their life expands and their understanding of the world is greater. And consequently, when it comes to becoming, they become, so it's the relevance. I call it relevance because the question is, how relevant is your support? How relevant is the access to the community that you actually make available? How relevant, how transformative it is to the students as individuals and also as members of the society, right? So that's why I call it relevance. So again, in here, in these sections, becoming and belonging, you no longer describe what you did in here, you evaluate your actions in the that you describe here in the area of range. And let me stress it again, just like with the Australian curriculum, for the purpose of assignment 1, I am not asking you to tell me how good you are. I'm asking you to learn to use independent criteria, which is what the curriculum or here ARIA's learning framework offers us, to use independent criteria to evaluate your own practice, right? So you're learning that evaluation is not about, or I do this and I do this and I do this, therefore I'm a good person. In on-campus classes, what I do is to explain to our students the difference between persuasive argument or text and also critically informed text. A persuasive text is one that picks whatever suits the person who's creating a text in order to make a really good text case for themselves, right? A persuasive text doesn't have to be critically informed. All it has to do is to actually make the person, is to convince the other person, to convince the audience, right? So if I write a persuasive text and I want to convince you, I can say, look, it doesn't really matter what people say, but red cars not necessarily are the fastest. What would those people know? If you actually look not at the intellectual discussions of those people who try to undermine that case, but if you actually look at the people who actually have fast cars, the people who actually drive them, the people who actually are rich, and when you look at the color of the cars, what color it is? Red. So there must be something to it, right? You see what I'm saying? So a persuasive text is not about logic. It's not about, it's not about um, science-informed logic. It's about emotional logic, right? You want to manipulate people to persuade people. So a poster is a persuasive text if it persuades people, or at least it's a good attempt to do that. An advertisement is a persuasive text because you want to persuade an audience to something. But when you actually create a critically informed text, what you need to do is to actually have criteria, independent criteria, against which you evaluate your own thoughts. And in that case, you actually have a genuinely critically informed text. So some of you are asking me, should I be responding to all of those? Yes, but I have a feeling that if you actually take an activity and do a good description of being and an evaluation of belonging and becoming, so basically how the examples that you identify in the range column, when you actually identified experiences on which you draw in order to provide rich experiences, when you evaluate them, then in the impact and relevance columns, I have a feeling that once you do it for 1 or 2, this will be actually repetitive. So you might actually see whether whatever you've written here is not actually repeated in these columns. I have a feeling that children are effective communicators is very much connected to children have a strong sense of identity because these things were written for teachers to actually learn how many dimensions there are to providing students with rich learning experiences, and that's great. But when you actually do an analysis of an activity the way I do, you will say that these are great, the whole range is great, but very often if you do it very well in here and then in here, these are actually repeated. So you can actually, so you do please respond to those two and draw on your area descriptions, right? So there. So basically the power of a model I am introducing you to is such that it shows that just by doing these two effectively, you actually are also responding to the other outcomes. Okay, so do respond to all of them, and if there's a repetition, then you just do that. Just say that, as explained before, these are the kinds of things I do, and as a result, children are exposed to, they're unable to actually interact verbally with others for a range of purposes. So by giving them access to a large to diverse texts, what you do actually is enable children to actually interact with texts from a range of genres, and also possibly with a range of purposes. So just reflect on it yourselves. But at this very moment, what I want to do is to take you through this column and see how to respond to the being, becoming, and belonging when we actually start identifying what these things actually involve. So I created here a purpose that some of you can actually copy and actually do yourselves. So you don't have to rewrite, you don't have to create your own statement describing your activity. You can just copy and paste this one. So what I'm saying here, in this assignment, I will describe how I use children's stories as a tool enabling me to identify positive features of role models described in those books in order to teach my daughter positive ways of relating to other people and herself. So we have here children's storybooks, right? So that's the first thing. So that's a literacy tool that community invented in order to do what? To entertain children, to pass knowledge to children, to pass cultural information to children, to shape children as well, right? So we have here the tool. Then we have a purpose. Whatever I'm doing, I want my daughter to gain from it knowledge about how to relate positively to other people and herself. So that's the effect. Whatever I will be describing that I'm doing in this activity with my daughter, it's not about anything. The focus is to show, to teach my daughter how to relate positively to other people and herself. And this is the beauty of me teaching you here how to focus your assignment or how to focus your responses. You do not write about everything, you write about this specific purpose. Whatever I'm describing in this activity, the guiding direction of this activity that I will describe is to illustrate how I use children's stories or storybooks in order to teach my daughter to relate to other people positively and also to relate to herself. And what I will be doing is looking at the features of role models, right? Positive features of role models described in those books, right? Positive features of role models. So I will be showing you how I use this particular way, which is to teach my child about the positive features of role models described in those stories, as a way, as a vehicle to teach my daughter positive ways of relating to other people and herself. So I'll be focusing on how I identify, or how I know how to identify positive features of role models described in these books, right? How I know how to identify positive features of role models described in these books, and how I integrate this knowledge in order to teach my daughter to relate to other people positively. Okay, so let's play with it and see what we can squeeze out of those outcomes in here. So the first one we have is children feel safe, secure, and supported, right? So we're having this outcome here, and you will notice that the same outcome is here, because we will be evaluating whatever we described in the range column here. We'll be evaluating in the impact in relation to the same criteria. Okay, so children feel safe, secure, and supported. So the question I ask here, how do you build capacity? And I will explain what that means, while the child also feels safe, secure, and so on. So how do you build capacity? In other words, how do you teach your child new skills, right? New knowledge, new skills. But that means also integrating challenge, right? Because we can't teach children anything unless there is a challenge, a context of challenge to which they have respond, right? So it's the challenge that generates problem-solving conditions that allow a child to identify a need for more knowledge. So, okay, so when you challenge your child, so the question is, how do you challenge your child in order for the child to feel the need for more knowledge, and at the same time, without making the child feel insecure, but the opposite, even though they are challenged through your interaction with the child, they also feel safe and secure and supported, right? So how do you do that? So let us first unpack what it would mean to identify positive features of role models in children's stories. So that would mean what? To identify what they say, how they are, how they dress, how they respond to people, how they feel, what words they use to express those feelings, how do these words make me feel? Where else did I see the same words and they made me feel the same way or maybe differently? Also, in what kinds of texts do we see in what kinds of texts do we see role models? There's not just one type of children's stories, right? So what do we have? We can have fairy tales. We can have what? I mean, I'm not really strong here. I wasn't raised in Australia. Okay, so we have fairy tales. What do we have? Nursery rhymes, right? Nursery rhymes. Then what else do we have? We have different types of books, especially designed for children to engage them. So when I was little, we had books from which we could cut out figures and do role plays and dress those figures up and do role plays and all of that. So what else do we have? So these are still print materials, right? Printed materials, but what else? Different media. So we could use different media, like video. We could use video. So there are children's stories which are actually read out by authors on YouTube. I'm not saying you're using them, but there are those. Then we can use animations, which are on YouTube as well, or on television or on video, right? A lot of parents go and hire videos to teach children, or to expose children to different stories. So one way to challenge your daughter, if you want to teach her how to relate to others, one way to challenge the child while at the same time enabling the child to feel safe, secure, and supported, is actually to give them access to a variety of different texts so that they, rather than just pounding one type of text and trying to extract meaning out of that, when children are exposed to a variety of different texts and even different forms of books and texts with which they can play and can interact differently, what happens, children are given access to a range of examples, and then through compare and contrast interactions that you have with the child or they themselves have with the child, they can actually expand their understanding of how different features of role models are represented and what they do in the text. In other words, an exposure to a variety of texts allows children to build richer associations between concepts, and in that way, yes, they are challenged because they don't do just apple, 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 this is apple, this is apple, this is apple for the whole week. There is no challenge, but there is abuse, right? Because you can't actually give one source to a child and um, expose them to just a very limited range of things. In fact, what happens is you give children access to a diversity of texts that allow children to interact with those texts in many different ways. They build rich associations through their interaction with the text and with you. So the challenge is there, but at the same time they feel safe and secure because they have enough support through that variety of interactions that you make available, that they can actually start organizing and reorganizing the understandings they have of the world in their heads. Little children do nothing else but create, or we do the same, but with children is actually more important maybe to a, let's assume because they're little, they create a theory of the world in their heads, right? And if we give them narrow, if we limit access to resources and to opportunities to interact, what children will come out with a limited understanding of how to interact with other people. So in this regarding this point, you can actually write quite a lot here. Describe different texts and describe different forms of interactions that they enable, and also describe your own interaction with the child to actually bring out those compare and contrast associations, so that children actually are feeling challenged, but also in a playful way. Playful means non-threatening, something that they need as opposed to something that you need them to know. The next point is actually something that I really, really want you to learn, and it's really, really important. And it will be important also for assignment 2. So the next description is that of this outcome is children develop emerging autonomy, interdependence, resilience, and sense of agency. This is what in my own model that you'll be learning in module 4, I call empowerment. Empowerment activities. But at this very moment, we have this description: develop emerging autonomy, interdependence, resilience, and sense of agency. Now, in order to actually address those things, you actually have to have a theoretical understanding of what these things actually mean. And I will just present it to you now, and then I will talk about implications. So what do they mean? I think in module 4, you have a paper which is by David Rock on resilience. So you will actually see yourself where it is. So you might read that. And he presents what he calls a SCARF model. This is a paper that is based on neuroscience experiments and findings. And what it does describe is what an organization, you think of, he talks about a workplace organization, you can translate it into a early childhood center or any school, right? So what an organization needs to provide in order for people to feel all those things: autonomy, interdependence, resilience, and have a sense of sense of agency. So he actually identified, well, not he, the neuroscience findings identified, I think, 5 or so components of resilience. These are the components that a workplace has to have present. Otherwise, people not only are not resilient, but the whole atmosphere in an institution actually falls apart. So the first thing that he talks about is status. Now think of status in the most abstract way. We all have a status. So for example, you in this, so status is something that actually neuroscientists and psychologists and biologists identified as the most important aspect of your life. If you do not have status, even if you're a monkey or an octopus, right? What you do, your brain actually shuts down and you are physically actually dying. A person without status has the responses in his or her brain which are the same as a person who is dying. And I mentioned octopus because this particular feature in our personalities, in our brains, is so ingrained that actually we have the same responses to the criterion of status as crustaceans do. So this is a biological feature inside of us that is as old as probably 1 billion years old or something like this. I don't know what's the biological distance between us and an octopus, but you can imagine it's relatively large, right? So it's relatively large between us and gorilla. It's probably 8 million years, 8 million of years. So between us and octopus, you can keep adding on. So status is very important. Everybody needs to feel they have a value of sorts. You remove that and you kill that person. So when we think of the dimension of this outcome, which is children develop their emerging autonomy, interdependence, resilience, and so on, we need to think about how, when interacting with a child, in order to make her sensitive to the positive features of role models, how do we illustrate in the text the things which they say, do, express, in order to account for status. So let's think a little bit about it, right? So it's really abstract, so let's think about it. So let's think of some story that you and I share. So I'm Polish and some of you come from different countries, or many of you come from different countries, but many of us know about Cinderella. So if you took a story of Cinderella, what language can you imagine Cinderella used in order when referring to her mom? She wasn't her mom, she was her stepmom and her stepsisters, right? So what language was Cinderella using to her stepmother and her stepsisters in order to express the status they had in her own world, right? So when you work with a child, you make these actions of the heroes visible by analyzing the gestuality, the text they use, the feelings they express, right? The things they wear. So if someone doesn't have a status in your life, you front up in, dress badly or uncombed, or, all of, I'm just making it up, but that's what I'm saying. So just to break it down a little bit. So Cinderella always was referring to her stepmother and her stepsisters positively, no matter what the condition, right? So it teaches the child that in order to have a positive impact on the world around you and also on yourself, no matter what the conditions, look at this positive hero, Cinderella. She used those kinds of words, those kinds of structures, these kinds of behaviors she was demonstrating, right? So all of that in order to show that mom, even though it was stepmom and the step siblings, actually had a high status in her world. And at the same time, what was the status? Remember, but relating to others and relating to herself. So in that way, what was the status of Cinderella in those interactions? Right? You can actually think about it. If you behave to people in the way that you acknowledge their relevance in your life, then what impact does this have on your own understanding of yourself? Now, of course, with children, you will turn it into words that they can understand, but I'm just teaching you to think about that. So if you refer with respect to other people, then it positions you also as a person who is or interacts or has in her world people who are relevant, not people who are irrelevant, right? So you instantly also boost your own relevance and your own status because you say, everybody in my company is relevant. I lead a relevant life. And I can imagine that when you actually analyze your activity and different texts with which you interact with your children, you could come up with a number of examples from texts, even from Cinderella alone, to show how you actually point out to the way in which text teach children about how to maintain status or express your feelings about someone's status. Now think about this. What is it called? This guy, Superman. Superman, right? Superman. Forgot about that. Okay. Now I'm not sure whether you use Superman with a 5-year-old, but if you watch Superman and the Superman is in his younger age, right? When the Superman was traveling through the universe and he saw some children abusing another child, what would the Superman do? How would the Superman react? What actions the Superman would do when the Superman saw someone being, abused one way or another, beaten up, or children were beating other children, or some women were, like whatever? What would he do? He would beat them up. So here you go. This is the moral dilemma I'm going to leave you with to solve in your own assignments, whether this is actually a positive way of solving problems, right? Sometimes that's all you can do, but I'm just not going to solve it for you. So this is your interactions with your children, so you can actually address it. But you can see how first when we looked to Cinderella, it was all nice and pink, but now when we looked at Superman, all of a sudden the way that status was actually engaged here and how Superman was expressing through his actions the way how he addressed someone else's status or position their status in his life, how different it was. Okay, the concept of certainty. Now, what theoretically it means that the person in a workplace, in school, should always feel certainty, which means that there are enough support mechanisms around them that they can always feel safe, that nothing is going to surprise, that they can rely on mechanisms and processes in their surroundings that will not cause their world to fall apart. And here we can already see that certainty was a little bit dubious. in the case of Cinderella, right? So when we look at the text of Cinderella, you can compare it with some other text for in assignment 1 to show how you would how you actually whether you to not to show to me, to discuss with me what text you could use even if you don't use in order to actually address this issue with your daughter or with your son. So in the case of Cinderella, that certainty was a little bit there. So the language that the author is using, yes, Cinderella has still the house, and that's a lot. Has still her father, and that's a lot, right? She does have a family, good or bad, but she has a family, but she is not in a situation where she can count. So that certainty is not necessarily all-inclusive, right? Not all elements are that supportive. So what happens? Sometimes her sisters are not necessarily referring to her well. Her stepmother gives her sometimes too much work to do, right? So her world now and then can fall apart because maybe not drastically, but to a point that she doesn't have enough free time to do the things that children do. But some things she has, some things she doesn't have. Now we can actually look into another story and have a look how authors in children's stories actually portray the role models, the conditions of the environment around the role models. And what comes out from this little description is that role models do not always emerge from magnificent conditions, right? So I'm too far away from children's stories, but you can come up with a number of stories where role models actually had it tough when they were little. Cinderella has it tough, right? But it's important here to see, for me to see, that you are aware that even if you don't do it, that you are aware that when you interact with the child through a range of texts, and the way you interact with those texts and with your child, you can actually reflect on that particular principle. That certainty is not necessarily prerequisite to being a role model hero. Autonomy now, theoretical autonomy, we are now here. We're still talking about David Rock's paper. So autonomy here, as David Rock describes it in his paper, means that people in the workplace, students, that people in the workplace should be given enough space to actually exercise their own power, right? So they are not always objects of someone's decisions. You must do this, you must do this, you must do that. That they are not treated like people with no competency, that actually they are trusted, that their competency is trusted, so they can exercise their self-efficacy capabilities. So now you can think for yourselves in those texts that you use with your children, how do those heroes, those positive heroes, exercise their autonomy? Is it always given to them? Do you see what I'm now driving at? Continuously through these discussions that I'm having with you, I'm showing that resilience is not necessarily something that is given to you, right? So what happens with those heroes in those stories is that that your status, your sense of certainty, and even your autonomy is not necessarily given to you, but what you do, you learn to actually create those opportunities for yourself. So what happened with autonomy and Cinderella? Did Cinderella exercise a degree of autonomy? Yes, she did, right? She ended up at the ball, but she didn't go to the ball by And that's what you can have a look at the text. I'm not saying you're doing this, but you do it probably in a different way. But now when I make you think about it, what happens, this discussion today makes you organize the things you do with children, and therefore gives you criteria so that when we actually do assignment 2, you can now be more systematic in the way you work with children. So here, what did Cinderella do? She went to the ball, but first she helped her sisters, right? So she helped them dress themselves and all of that stuff that needed to be done. What does it Cinderella do? She did all the chores that stepmother told her to do, right? So she did the potatoes, she cleaned up the fireplace, all of those things that the stepmother told her to do, right? So it's not like Cinderella was given the autonomy, but because of her love for people, and she did love people, but she didn't kill in herself, right? So she was still, what was the idea here in this assignment, what we're doing? Is how to relate to others and to oneself, right here. So she didn't kill her own desires, right? So she exercised her autonomy not because she still had her own desires, but she didn't address them by relegating others to like removing a status from others. What she did, she addressed the things she had to do, and still somehow um, the universe created opportunities for her, or she created opportunities for herself through her um, non-confrontative approach to life to actually, good things happened to her, and she went to the ball, she had the dress. Not only that, she met the prince and good things happened. The next principle that we have here that impacts on people's sense of resilience in workplace is relatedness. What they actually talk about here is that people need to be related to other people. They have to feel the sense that they relate to other people, right? So you can see how this principle is connected to status. You are part of many. Human beings um, calibrate their own status and their own sense of self in relation to others. So they have to feel that they are related to others, that there are relationships among them that actually can sustain them. So now again, what do we do in assignment 1? We look at different texts with different heroes, right? And we look at the kinds of features in those texts of role models, and we analyze them now from the perspective of how that sense of relatedness was expressed in the things they did, the way that the things they said, the emotions they expressed, and so on. So in terms of Cinderella, let us think. You might analyze the text and have a look how Cinderella was finding her sense of relating to others in the text. So she loved her first mom, right? She loved her father. She loved her sisters. She loved her grandmother. She loved the butterflies. She loved potatoes. She loved the fireplace. In fact, I can't think of one thing that Cinderella didn't love, right? So she surrounded herself through her own love to a number of people and things in her life, right? So her love created her life. So you can look for those components in text and describe it. I'm just giving you direction. You can actually use this direction as an inspiration to actually create more out of it. Okay, so let's move to the next ingredient, which is here. Fairness. So David Rock talks about fairness. It's that in an environment, in a workplace environment, people have to feel that there is some sort of fairness, which means, if I do a good thing, um, I'm expected to be rewarded by it one way or another. And as opposed to if I do a good things, I get blamed for it. And if some other person does a good thing, they are blessed for it. Like there has to be some form of equity in the system, and some form of and a sense that gives people stability. Okay, so let's look at fairness in Cinderella, right? I mean, it comes to us straight away. What happened? Through the love she created, right? By giving people status. But I can't remember what I was talking about certainty here, but you can rewind this recording. By exercising her own autonomy, by relating through her love to people and objects around her, what happened is that fairness was there in many ways, right? Fairness was there because she still had her father there and her love, but also the universe, which is the world around her, responded with fairness. So it's not that she demanded fairness, but by her attitude of herself being inclusive emotionally to people, what happened? The world responded to her with the same as she was giving out. And it's a wonderful lesson to children, right? It's a wonderful lesson. Be nice and the world will respond to you with niceness. So here we have this fairness, right? So what happened? She did get a dance with the prince. Not only that, the prince responded to her, and the universe brought the prince into her house and all of that. So sometimes, so the point of the whole Cinderella story, you can see how strong is this story now when we look at it through these categories of resilience. The point of the story is that not all of this has to be present in the environment, but what we learn when actually examining text and looking at the heroes, that very often those role models didn't have it given to them. But there was a give and take, and especially there was a give. And that's a lovely lesson for children. So you can see how analyzing text in relation to these categories, or specifically in this case, by analyzing how authors portrayed or presented role models, positive role models in their stories, by analyzing the text and all kinds of dimensions, what these role models were, how they spoke, how they felt, how they expressed themselves around people, and so on. How we can learn now how powerful those stories were in order to develop those concepts in children, which is the point of assignment 1, to describe how you actually do it. And therefore, for assignment 2, if you were to think how to provide such conditions, right, so that to develop in children emerging autonomy, interdependence, resilience, blah, 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 you will need to provide texts that enable children to actually explore, reflect on, and analyze those concepts. Okay, let's move to the next one. See how easy it is? It's easy. Children develop knowledgeable and confident self-identities. So how did I question that? I mean, I put in red a question to it to help us to think about this category. I would suggest that here, the idea really is in this category is about the ways in which you allow children to develop deep associations so that they can learn to integrate what they learn, right? So the question is, how deep associations do you develop for children to learn to integrate what they learn? So if we just read books without actually, and that's okay because parents are busy, but without, and that's okay, you can describe it, but you can critically relate to it if you're one of those people. Obviously, my mother would have been one of them. My mother was reading and had some purpose, but didn't have time to analyze and discuss things with me as she was falling asleep while reading to me after the chores. Remember, it was a long time ago when we had to do everything by hand, unimaginable to some people. So one way you can actually work with children is to jump from one text to another and explore each text almost as if it was a world of its own. That's one way. But for children to build capacity, for children to actually learn knowledge and start developing confidence, which means here that in relation to working with a child on text that build their capacity to actually learn something from role models, the idea is uh, to reflect, for you to reflect about the range of experiences that you generate for children to create links between different texts, between different behaviors, between different ways in which the role models reacted and acted, right? So not just a text in and of itself for its own sake, but where else have you seen? How else was it done? What other opportunities exist? So now the child integrates the different understandings they created with you over the period of time. And now the new text is like a greater adventure. It's not new that much, because in every next text is another adventure that they can approach more confidently, with more knowledge and a greater capacity to actually respond to your questions and analyze the behaviors and the actions of the heroes. The last point here is children learn to interact in relation to others with care, empathy, and respect. There are many ways probably to interpret this in relation to the activity that we are describing for assignment 1, but if here was about how to create links between different texts for children to approach new texts with greater confidence, here the idea would be think for ourselves how we take this knowledge from those texts and now build on it in real life. So what we want is to implement the so-called curriculum, we might say, that we had with our children when we were reading those stories, with a specific purpose to learn from role models. So how we implement all that knowledge now into real life. So if the child comes home and says something, reports on something, you can refer to those stories. You can remind them. You can examine what would Cinderella do. Now, my mother, and this is really funny, but my mother used to, I mean, I was convinced I was going to be a princess when I was little. I mean, there was no way of actually talking me out of that. So one way, and I was also a tomboy, which didn't go very well with a princess idea. So when my mother, who was also young when she had me, obviously, when she wanted me not to do some things, right, which somehow my mother thought didn't belong to the repertoire of girls' behavior, she would say to me, a princess wouldn't do that. So if I was climbing some rocks, I would be off the rocks in 1 second, right? The princess wouldn't do that, and I was off the rocks. So the idea is to build on the history that you develop through those readings with children, and now use it for the reflection with children in order for them now to understand that those texts are not just abstract animations for the fun of it, right? They are actually they actually are foundations for building our personalities. Obviously, you don't say it to them this way, but you need to understand it. Now, I'm not saying that in an assignment 1, you will tell me all that story, that you understood it and you knew it before I told you that. But what I would like you to do, to use my description and my story that I generated right now, for you to critically reflect on how you work with children with stories, and tell me where you do particular things, what text, what expressions you analyze, and where you actually don't do particular things, right? Because this is a critical reflection assignment. This is not something that I will be judging you on when in regard to your teacher capacities. Now, once you have done this analysis of the range in this particular category, in this particular column, I would like you to now look at the concept of diversity and run your and evaluate the texts and the expressions and the behaviors and even the heroes that you were using to describe your activity with your children. I would like you to run them now against the question of diversity. How many, whether they are all those heroes and those stories relating to the culture, which is the most familiar to you, whether you actually integrate cultural models and cultural stories and heroes from cultures and countries of which are less familiar to the child, right? Because the idea is here about belonging. So in the Australian curriculum, we talk about the impact, we talk about the ethical or intercultural capabilities, which is no different than belonging, which is the range of the things that you expose your children to, the cultural behaviors, the values, the understandings, right? Now, anyway, so how is the community reflected through them, for those, right? What kind of community do they legitimize? Is it still the closest community of a child, or are you actually attempting to expand it so that when a child sees an Asian person or a person like me with an accent, they don't scream and they don't panic, right? So and I'm not saying that you do that, but this is something to think about. And then the next one is, of course, about the transformative impact of your activity with children, which is about evaluating the range of texts and experiences that you actually engage your children in. So that was evaluated, and you evaluated also your range against the concept of diversity, and now you know pretty well what kind of personal and social transformative impact your engagement with those children's stories your engagement has with those children's stories has on the child, personal and social impact. So how transformative personally are those activities for a child? So remember about the diversity component, right? But you can say, well, personally, they actually build their emotional vocabulary, they build their understanding, their self-power, they do or not, you can evaluate it for yourselves. But socially also, are they becoming part of a greater world than just mommy, daddy, and next uncle? Or are you actually making them aware that gradually, of course, they're little, right? They're anything between 2 and 6. So I think the children at 2 are still up to the age of 2 or 2.5, 3. They still up to the age of 2. Definitely, they kind of work within a narrow range of family people, right? So, and they tend to play on their own. Very rarely they engage with other children in prolonged activities. But we're talking anything between 2 and 6, whether the activities you create with them and the diversity that you engage in those activities, whether they also change them as members of the society, right? So do they change their idea of who they are in relation to other people? So you basically discuss that. So no longer you have to do the language analysis and so on. You've done it in the range column. The belonging and becoming are places where you actually evaluate your activities. And now the task becomes increasingly easy, so I don't actually have to have those questions anymore here, and I'm starting to remove them. So when you work with your child, remember we're not losing focus, we're still talking about children's stories, enabling you to identify positive features of role models, right? So here, can you think of text and can you analyze those texts to show how the role models understood that they were part of the community and also understood of the reciprocal, understood the reciprocal rights and responsibilities necessary for active community participation. So what did we have? We had Cinderella, right? We went on with Cinderella, and we're still teaching your child, not just with Cinderella, but you will be using different texts, and I would like you to show different text or discuss different texts, but I am not very fluent with Australian children's stories or English children's stories, so you have to forgive me here. But what happened with Cinderella? Was she a member of the community? As much as we have learned from the book, her community, at least in the book, was the family. And she understood the reciprocal rights and responsibilities for her community to function, right? What she did was she took over the role of her mother, right? So when once mother died, someone had to actually make sure that things actually happen in the house. And the book is very traditional and obviously on purpose. So it's not like back then it was necessarily on the female that had to look after the house. But the book is structured in order to actually show that Cinderella not only didn't reject those responsibilities, but she actually took them on and understood that things had to be done. And that's a simplified way of me actually addressing it. But you can actually exemplify how in different texts the role models actually understood the need for community to function, that in order for a community to function and be healthy, people actually take on responsibilities, and you can actually analyze the text from this perspective. See how nicely it is now, how nicely we actually can work with these categories now. And that community are complex, right? So children respond to diversity with respect. So the idea is now to look for texts, to examine text with your daughter, where the role models understood that communities are complex. I can now think of a different story than Cinderella. For example, in The Lion and the Mouse, some of you might not know it, but you can actually find it on YouTube. So what happened? Say the lion didn't understand that the community is complex, right? So what happened to that? So in The Lion and the Mouse story, the role model is the mouse. And it goes like this. So the lion didn't understand that the community is complex. So when the lion was frustrated because the lion had a tough day hunting, right? And the little mice scrambled over his back on their way home. When they woke him up, he grabbed one of them and he said, "You know, I could kill you." And obviously, this is a terrifying language, right? So you can analyze, you can tell me this is a terrifying language, but what happened? The mice explained to him that the mouse, this particular mouse that he caught, explained to him, "Oh, please, please, please don't kill me, because I might one day be useful to you," right? So this is a community cohesion. We're diverse, we're different, come in different types and sizes, but all of us actually contribute something. And the lion obviously laughed at the little mouse and said, "What can a thing that small as you do for me? I am the king of the jungle." Nevertheless, the lion let the mouse go. Right, and sometime later, the lion got caught in the net, and what happened? The mice was nearby, and they came to him, and in order to show him their gratitude for letting them go, they bit through the net in which the lion was caught and let the lion free. And then lion realized that we are all a community, we all in one way or another depend on one another, right? So children respond with diversity with respect. So now here's a text teaching children that we are all one, and despite of our differences, we all contribute a little bit, and we need to be respectful of one another. And it was very good that lion, whether intentionally or not, did let the mouse go, because then later on, look what happened. When the lion was in need, the help came. So that's an example of text. So you can see that what I'm doing here through this little chat with you, I'm looking at those different categories and trying to analyze them in relation to how children can learn all these qualities from texts and how you can actually structure interaction with children and the choices of resources with children in order for children to start building a greater repertoire of those qualities that are in role models, and then they can actually not just predict what texts are all about, which very often then it's translated as such in the Australian curriculum, but more like actually learn about what it takes to be a person in the community and also integrate it into their own life. One of the reasons why I chose the concept of role models, it's because little children actually internalize behaviors that they see in front of them, right? So they internalize them, and role models are extremely important. In fact, I was reading this, and actually on the internet, not reading, but watching the video. Later on, I read her paper. I'll just write here, okay? Her name is Helen Imordino, double M. How did the thing know? The Imordino Young. Okay, so Helen Imordino Young works with Professor Antonio Damasio, um, and they're both neuroscientists. But Helen Imordino tries to make actually connections to education, sometimes in a happy way, sometimes in a less happy way, because she is, after all, only a neuroscientist. But anyway, what she's saying, because children internalize the models in front of them, it is much better to expose children to positive stories, to stories with positive role models rather than with negative role models, right? So rather than horror stories, have Cinderella, have The Lion and the Mouse, have stories of Robin Hood, have stories of characters from which children can from which children can actually learn how to be in the society, so that they can actually draw on those heroes, put them in their head, and consequently on that basis develop their own personalities, right? So we don't want a situation where children only learn from parents, because as great as parents are and as great examples as they provide, we need to expand. That's why children go to school, to expand those examples or inform them better, to build richer associations about those qualities that their parents represent, right? So what she's saying, use positive role models, use stories with positive role models. And that's why I today was trying to run this activity using early years learning framework by looking at children's stories and positive role models. I have spoken enough about it, so you can actually take on this analysis further yourselves. You don't need me anymore to go through each of those aspects, and you have now been shown how to respond to this activity for assignment 1 and how to look at texts in order to make these qualities visible as you interact with children through those texts. And you can actually evaluate your work or your activity with children for assignment 1, and you do it critically, meaning you are now more aware what is involved. And it doesn't mean that you implement all these things that I have discussed today, but at least if you mention in the assignment that I might not be doing this, but I now am aware that I could do this and this and this, right? So now you actually explain to me that your depth of understanding of the potential that you in those children's stories has grown, and you could do this, you could use this story for this effect, and you could use this story and another form of genre and so on, right? So that I can now understand that you have the concept of a learning resource in your head. And what I mean by a learning resource is not something you construct, although this is how probably assignment 2 is defining learning resource. But anyway, by learning resource, what I mean is you understand that in order for children to develop resources for meaning, they have to have an exposure to meaning. And in order to have an exposure, they have to have activities that allow them to break down the exposure into minute bits that allow them to question what does, who is who, what do these people do, how do these people do that, why do these people do this, what are the alternatives, right? Which is exactly what we were doing in this little tutorial today. So there. So I wanted to finish for today, and I hope that that gave you enough of tools to complete assignment 1, and from now on we will be moving towards assignment 2. Thank you very much.